Hello and welcome to this introductory video for a series on the aesthetic and social roots of Joy Division. I'm going to be exploring some of the factors that gave rise to the band. Not only the music they listened to, but the society that they lived in. Their aesthetic feel was influenced by the liminal spaces that they occupied, physically and psychologically. They were influenced by the social structures around them, by the counterculture, by alienation and decay. All these played a part in the formation of the hive mind that was Ian Curtis, Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook and Stephen Morris. The aesthetics, philosophy and psychology of Joy Division could have only really arisen at a particular point in space and time. Each member brought attitudes and influences shaped by life in what could have ironically been called Greater Manchester at that time. A band is the product of its members. Each brings their own experience, influences and energy into the equation. The members of Joy Division were all quite distinct personalities and that showed through in the music. The chemistry of a band is essential. So let's have a look at the different personalities that made up Joy Division. Now, we're going to be talking about two separate groups of people. As shorthand, we can consider them two subspecies. Firstly, there's Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook, working class beer-loving Salford boys. We'll refer to them from now on as the lads. The other group I'll call the oddballs. Ian Curtis and Stephen Morris went to the same school a year apart. They never associated during school despite sharing interests. Their town, Macclesfield, was green and a few social levels above Salford. It was well connected by train to the centre and suburbs, and so to youth culture. Suburban kids visited the big city a lot. City kids almost never visited the suburbs. Both Curtis and Morris are remembered by the former book and record shop owners of Greater Manchester as being inquiring teenage presences. Now, the north of England in particular suffered during the economic nightmare of the 1970s. Factories closed, dole queues grew. Manchester, along with Salford, was the home of the Industrial Revolution. It's difficult to overstate how central to the history of the Western world the city was. Aside from being the birthplace of industrialisation, it's where unionisation was born. 200 years ago, Manchester mill workers refused to work with cotton harvested by slaves in the south of America. It was a progressive place. The Communist Manifesto was conceived in Manchester. Engels worked in a mill. Smiths fans will no doubt rejoice in the fact that the modern vegetarian movement started there too. It had been a vibrant, busy city, made famous by the paintings of Ellis Lowry, who depicted the hordes of factory workers going to and from work. Families lived in row houses, close up and personal. Whole families worked in the same jobs, whole communities worked together and lived together. Once production was moved out of town, there was nothing left but poverty. Factory Records impresario Tony Wilson described Manchester in the mid-70s as being like a piece of history that had been spat out. The centre of the city was a lot smaller than it is today, and it was surrounded by a ring of decaying industrial wasteland. The city centre was a purely commercial zone, somewhere you went to buy things. There was nothing open on a Sunday or after 5 o'clock. No one lived in the city centre, and unless you were buying something or working there, you had no business being there. Joy Division's music evoked the empty spaces that surrounded the centre of Manchester, spaces full of memories. In 1976, The year that the Sex Pistols famously played the Lesser Free Trade Hall gig in Manchester, James Anderton was appointed as Chief Constable of the city. Now, Anderton was a moralist. He was deeply authoritarian and he wielded great power. Anderton was very religious. He was a pious man who believed he spoke to God each evening. As he saw it, he was doing God's work. He hated pornography, obscenity, or what he saw as obscene anyway. He seized and burned everything he could. For criminals, he proposed corporal punishment, essentially torture, until they begged for mercy and repented their sins. Nice guy. He also waged war on nightlife and social culture. 24 nightclubs were closed down in the city centre. Of the ones that remained open, closing times and licensing laws were very, very severely enforced. He was a Puritan, he had his own army, and he was doing whatever he could to drain the joy out of a once great city centre. So Manchester had once been the world's first industrial city, but along with much of northern Britain, it was now post-industrial. Bernard Sumner's spoken multiple times about the sense of loss he felt growing up. It was the loss of community he was describing. The substandard housing he grew up in was destroyed. Neighbours split up and sent to different estates. Buzzcocks manager Richard Boone had this to say: Manchester seemed like a vacant set. Some kind of neutron bomb had been dropped, leaving derelict buildings. There was no centre of gravity. It was the cradle of capitalism, and it was rapidly becoming its grave. So the old, cosy Coronation Street style communities were no more. In their place were brutalist tower blocks in the wasteland. There was nothing to drive the economy for the residents. The lucky few worked for the government, NHS or local council. They existed, often supporting whole families. For the others, there were the rapidly growing dole queues. In the 1950s, then Prime Minister Harold Macmillan had declared to the country that they'd never had it so good. Nobody could say that now. The 70s was a long slog of shortages, strikes and protests. Nobody was saying they had it good. Nobody had it good. There was a general disquiet in the air. Something had to give in such a run-down, dirty country. Salford itself had a reputation for being unclean long beforehand. Ewan MacColl wrote his famous song Dirty Old Town in its dubious honour. It was also, by all accounts, a violent town, full of thieves and gangs. Pete Oak particularly was primed for violence from a young age. And this carried over into Joy Division and New Order. The city of Salford itself didn't experience regeneration for decades. It wasn't an environment that encouraged anything seen as pretentious in young people. Students were very much encouraged to stay in their lane. Bernard Sumner, for instance, had an interest in the visual arts. He was told by a teacher, creativity will get you nowhere. You'll end up working in a factory, lad. There was a double irony. By the time Bernard Sumner left school, there were no factories left. But of course it was his aesthetic eye and curiosity about the world and indeed the universe that led him to find one of the most iconic images in music history, the Unknown Pleasures pulsar. It's probable that in more optimistic times, at least one of Joy Division would have gone to university, and that would have meant that the band would never have existed in the first place. Instead, they all left school at 16, wanting nothing to do with further education at all. A great part of it seems to be being put off by the conformity and what they saw as the establishment. Only Steve Morris didn't actually make the decision for himself. He was thrown out for a youthful zeal for sipping cough syrup on school grounds. There were many aspects of Ian Curtis' personality, but I'll be honing in on them as we go on in this series. He had a generally happy childhood. He loved to joke, he loved to please people. He was a lifelong dog lover. His father was an officer for the railway police, a thoughtful man who himself wrote. His mother was a housewife. Ian Curtis was eager to leave school and get onto the job market, and it was a contrary move. He was considered a bright pupil, and he was a voracious reader from an early age. This is the first of the contradictions that, for me, make Ian Curtis such a fascinating personality. He was a young man whose form of rebellion was ultimately to conform to society, to straight society. He left school, joined the job market, got married because he saw it was the right thing to do. He wanted his wife to stay at home to raise children. At the same time though, he was obsessed with transgressive culture, shocking books like William Burroughs and J.G. Ballard. As near to a faith for him were Lou Reed, Iggy Pop and David Bowie, the Father, Son and Holy Ghost that would inspire so many punk upstarts. His first date with soon-to-be wife Deborah would in fact be to see Bowie on his Ziggy Stardust tour. He had a need for more records, more culture. It's possible that feeding his cultural habit was one reason that he left school so early. Having a real wage, being able to buy those Stooges import bootlegs. Having a father as a policeman didn't stop him being a little light-fingered. He used the greatcoat that he was famous for wearing for stealing books and records in. So he was a traditional middle-class breadwinner, a thief with Jim Morrison daydreams. At some point, the stress of harbouring all those different personalities would have to give. As we'll see throughout this series, Ian Curtis was a chameleon. He changed according to the surroundings. If the going was boisterous, he could be as much of an oik as anybody. But he was a devoted family member. He was a diligent civil servant, and he could discuss Dostoevsky and the finer points of German history with the best. Like Joy Division themselves, he was an enigma. To the lads in Salford, Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook met at age 11. So they didn't quite grow up together, but once they did meet, they were pretty much inseparable as friends. Sumner in particular had a somewhat gothic childhood. Salford was very underprivileged in the 1960s. Breathing the air was equivalent to smoking 70 cigarettes a day. It was classed as one of Europe's biggest and worst slums. From his house there was an outside toilet and air raid shelter to play inside left over from the war. The water was so impure, he says, that there were little fish in it. His father had left when he was 1, so he was brought up by his mother and grandparents. Now, being a single mother in the 1960s was considered scandalous, and this was only made worse by the fact that his mother suffered from cerebral palsy, a condition which no doubt drew cruel taunts from adults and children alike. Now, Peter Hook also came from what's called a broken home, but his story is a little less dramatic. He was raised by his grandparents between the ages of 3 and 6. That was because of the stigma of a mother bringing up a child on her own. So she took him back in after remarrying. And that's when he took on his stepfather's surname. And Sumner also took his stepfather's surname as well. A curious detail of Pete Hook's childhood is how he, for a time, I'm not quite sure how long, I think definitely more than a year, he lived in Jamaica with his stepfather and the rest of the family. They lived there in the sunshine until returning to the dirty old town. Stephen Morris visited the area. He didn't grow up there, but he saw the decay of Manchester and the evolution of what was going on there over time. He said when he first started visiting, there were terraced houses everywhere. And then those terraced houses started to get ripped down and it was replaced by wasteland. Then, after a little time, the wasteland was replaced by new concrete buildings. These concrete buildings seemed futuristic, alien at first. Bernard Sumner says he didn't see a tree until the age of 9. And it was then that his community was ripped apart. When the old terrace slums were torn down, Sumner's family were placed in a brutalist tower block. He thought it was great at the time. He could see a tree from his window. Just one. Now, Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner went to the same school in Salford. It was what was called a grammar school. Now, these are meant to guide more able students towards achievement. The teaching and teachers, of course, did nothing of the sort. It was at that school that they both adopted a kind of proto-punk hatred of authority. It was a stubbornness that would go on to mark out their careers of both Joy Division and New Order. At various points, they were involved in the skinhead culture. Now, it's important to note that this is many years before the skinhead became a synonym for racist thug in the public imagination. The original skinheads were into ska and reggae music. Perhaps Hook felt more of an affinity with the music having lived on the island. It's most probable he was just going along with the flow with his mates. Both were also loosely affiliated with scooter culture. Now, scooter culture is a subculture centered around mobility and fun. Scooter boys tended to be into black American soul music. Now, a curious detail here is while Joy Division came out of punk and prefigured goth, they generally dressed like soul boys. Short, tidy hair, shirts, jumpers, slacks. A fun detail is that Sumner's scooter was named Abraxas, after the Santana album too. So there's a mix of influences. Now, at this time, there was more infrastructure being invested in with kids in Manchester. There were youth clubs, and these were basically places that kids could have parties. They could put on their choice of music, and as long as they didn't make any trouble, there was no problem. A lot of kids got a taste for basically discos, concerts through doing this. Joy Division themselves played a gig just before they recorded Unknown Pleasures in a youth club, Bowden Vale, in the south of Manchester. So here were Hook and Sumner, two working class kids, music fans, normal lads. Forming a band wasn't a thing that people like them did until they did. Now, of the four, Stephen Morris is the one born into the most privilege. His father was a salesman. He was making good money from commissions on materials for the new tower blocks that was springing up all over Greater Manchester. Times were good for the Morrises, if a little quirky. There was no shortage of trees in Stephen Morris's childhood. Macclesfield by the River Bollin, to its east is a forest. It's technically in Cheshire and it lies to the south of Manchester. It's a manufacturing town, and it's one that managed to stay alive during the economic horrors of the 1970s. Nowadays, AstraZeneca has its manufacturing hub there. There's paper, plastics, engineering, those kind of things. So things were a lot easier in Macclesfield all round. But that didn't mean that Stephen Morris had his own room. His father shared the bedroom with him and would rise bright and early each morning to play jazz LPs, very loud. I suspect that his habit of doing this was the reason he wasn't allowed to share the marital bed. In any case, Morris came to associate jazz with having to wake up early and just wanting it to go away. Still, it seems Morris was indulged as a child. His father organised swing concerts, and he paid for instruments for his son, guitar and later drums. And if we can take one marker of a tolerant, possibly indulgent parent, it's buying a drum kit for your child. But he did warn him, drummers, Stephen, I've never met a sane one yet. They all end up taking morphine and drinking absinthe. You don't want to end up like that, do you? Now, it seems that didn't seem like too much of a bad idea to the young Stephen Morris, so he bashed away at his drum kit, determinedly staying away from the intricate, showy style expected of drummers at the time. Both Stephen Morris and Ian Curtis were both avid readers. John Savage has commented that the 1970s were a golden age for paperback publishing, And you can see this when you go around any antique or second-hand bookshop in Britain. So Morris would skip school and go and rummage through the racks, see if there's anything that took his fancy. One of the things that did take his fancy was Michael Moorcock, who was very much the rock and roll science fiction writer at the time. He was involved with Hawkwind. His Jerry Cornelius books were they had lots of rock and roll tropes in their cliches, and Ulrich of Melnibourne, his characters, got a few similarities to David Bowie, at least in looks. So a little less cerebral than the tortured Russians that Ian Curtis loved, but a universe away from the lads in Salford. So this was the hinterland between the hippie era and punk. The counterculture didn't really know where it was going or what it was going to do. But one thing it did know it was going to do was getting high. And as a member of the counterculture, the young Stephen Morris took it upon himself to become a psychonaut. These experiments, of course, led him to getting thrown out of school, but they led him to appreciate jazz a little late. For whatever reasons, all the members of Joy Division entered the job market at the age of 16 and experienced the crushing reality that is day-to-day work for so many people. It's this space between childhood and maturity that I'm going to be looking at as the first of the liminal spaces in the next video. Okay, so thanks for watching first of all. Big thanks to everyone who's recently subscribed. There's been a lot of views on the video I did on Martin Hannett and Joy Division, so this is kind of following up on there. I'll be trying to unpick some of the layers that go on with this band, but I find it endlessly fascinating, to be honest. Thanks for watching. Please do like, subscribe, all that business. Leave nice comments. It all helps. Thank you very much. Take care. Look after yourselves. Bye. 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 Bye.